A few weeks ago, I participated in a conversation, kind of a training oriented around justice. And it was organized by some leaders from my previous denomination. And I took part. I led out in a workshop about allyship. I joined with another girl who also had a similar experience as me, who was a part of that spiritual tribe and who was queer. And so we talked together and, talked about, some of the things that we thought that folks could do to be better allies. And, the truth is that as I took part in this and as I agreed to take part in it, I felt a little bit scared. I wasn't sure how folks would react. I wasn't sure if I was going to see old colleagues and what they would say. It felt a little bit uncomfortable. Would I be the only trans person there? I certainly felt like I was the only trans person there. Would people say transphobic stuff? I didn't know what was going to happen, and it just felt a little bit scary. It felt sensitive. But in the end, it felt like it was worth that risk, because I felt like, gosh, these folks are trying to push the ball forward in a great way, and so I'd love to, try to partner with them. And there might be parents there of queer kids, and there might be folks who are in the closet, and so, maybe by me being there and sharing my story, I can kind of, help them stay on the planet a little bit, kind of harm reduction, if you will. And so I went, and it felt like it was worth the risk, and it was lovely, and it went well, and I'm going to tell you something about it at the very, very end, so you have to wait for that. But I shared not long afterward on Facebook. I shared this picture. I felt like I had this really cute, you can't really see it here, but I had this velvet jumpsuit thing going on and this biker jacket deal, and I felt really, really cute. So I went on one of my trans, social media boards, and I shared that and said, yeah, I got invited by this, church group, and I got to share about allyship. I was so excited. And I was surprised by the hostility that was met with, I know that as a trans lady, I don't always feel super safe in church spaces, and especially conservative church spaces, but also what I've discovered is that as a Christian, I don't always feel totally, wanted in queer spaces. And I think that there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. And what I noticed is when I shared on this kind of message board about the presentation that I gave, I got a lot of these reactions oh, brother, of course, right? And I had folks saying, what the heck are you doing? Why are you going to this thing? Why are you doing this? Don't you know that the church, that Christianity, this religion, is causing us harm and plans to cause us harm in the future? Don't you realize that by you being there, you're legitimizing this group? It's going to cause other people harm. And it was kind of intense and kind of jarring. But I have to admit, I don't feel like I was just thinking now, I don't feel like it's maybe completely surprising. I had a really long conversation with one girl who, tried to explain, where she was coming from. And it became clear to both of us that she had been deeply, deeply hurt by religion, right? She had been harmed in so many different religious contexts. And so she is deeply, deeply sensitive to, the thought that there could be any good there, because she had been so wounded. And so her reactivity, her sensitivity was just automatic, and it came to the surface immediately. And I really feel for that, I empathize for that. And so I want to acknowledge that, I feel like there's a certain degree in which my presence, even here at Paradox, it carries some weight and carries some risk. And, some of you might roll your eyes, oh, brother, girl, come on, you're not that important. But, I feel sensitive about that reality. I don't want someone out there to see me preaching at a church and then to think, okay, well, I'm just going to go back to my own local church and then get hurt again. Which is real, I've been leading a group organized around helping queer people recognize and heal from religious trauma or religious harm for the last 6 months. And it has been such an honor to sit with people who have been wounded, people from all different traditions, but mostly Christianity, because here in this country we are mostly Christian, but folks from all different. And we've just kind of been examining what it feels and what it looks like and what we've gone through and sort of comparing and contrasting what our experiences have been. And it's been a really, really beautiful thing and a sobering thing and an encouraging thing. It's been validating to hear other people speak my story out of their mouths without realizing that they were speaking my story. But one of the things that I've come to realize and understand is that harm, especially to queer people through religion, is pervasive. It lasts a really, really long time. It's persistent. It's so hard to work through. And I have to tell you that queer people being sensitive in, religious spaces, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg for how it affects us. Like, that's definitely there, but that's kind of just the beginning of it. And so today I want to talk a little bit about some of the hues, right? Some of the colors of religious trauma or religious harm. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about harm reduction at the very, very end. So my hope is kind of twofold. Like, one, on the one hand, if you're someone who's here and you're queer, maybe by hearing some of this stuff, you'll be able to say hello to some of the stuff that might have gone on for you. Some things that you maybe haven't said hello to yet. Maybe you'll feel validated. Like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one. So, maybe on that, level. And I think for a lot of us, in order to really go through healing and really to recover, the first step often is noticing it and accepting it and acknowledging it. And then maybe secondarily, for those of us who are cisgender or who are heterosexual allies here in this space, often you are the ones who are in power. Often you are the ones that are able to make decisions and change things. And so maybe you will be inspired by hearing some of this suffering to use the power in the context that you have to take risks to make the world a safer and better place for everyone. So that's kind of like, my goal along the way here. So first, I want to take a couple minutes to define trauma, and then to define religious trauma in particular. Now, sometimes when we talk about trauma, folks might be dismissive, right? Like, oh, that's not trauma. Back in my day, we just rubbed a little dirt on that and went on, right? Or, in a religious space, we might even use spiritual bypassing, right? Oh, this happened, but the Lord can help me get through everything. The Lord is, the Lord is my strength. God will not give you anything more than you handle. And it's sort of a way of pretending like it didn't happen and just sort of pushing it on by the side. And it's true, we haven't always used the word trauma to describe these experiences. It's really true. Here's a really, really quick history and just sort of a snapshot. And we use oftentimes when we think about and talk about trauma, we think about war because war is incredibly traumatic. And so during the time of the Civil War, trauma, the experiences of trauma, the symptoms of trauma was described as the soldier's heart or nostalgia. That's how it was described. And then in World War II, or in World War I, we often called it shell shock, which is maybe a little bit more common term. In World War II, it was called battle fatigue, this set of, really acute symptoms that came from experiencing these overwhelming events. Sometimes it was called moral weakness, right? During and, kind of following the Vietnam era war and the Korean Wars, we started to sort of understand and kind of develop this language around trauma. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was introduced into the DSM, which is the manual that we use in therapy to kind of help guide us and identify what's going on in folks. It was first introduced in 1980, right? So right around the time that I was born. I'm dating myself. But even up until then, it was always, trauma was focused on, a very discrete traumatic incident, like a really, really intense one-time event. But then in time, we later learned that trauma can be chronic, that it can happen to kids. We had the ACEs study that came out. We identified that, if you grow up in an environment where you experience a death in the home, or a parent who's incarcerated, or if you experience addiction, or if you experience all kinds of different stuff, you experience abuse or divorce, that can be traumatizing, right? So we've kind of gradually grown our understanding of it, and so we use that language more and more. Now, in my clinic, this is how I tend to talk about trauma in my practice and with my clients. I like to say that trauma isn't the event in and of itself. So like an event isn't a trauma. Trauma is like the body's response to an event that's really overwhelming, or that's unexplainable, or it's hard to understand, or it's incomprehensible, or it's agonizing, or inescapable, where we feel trapped. So there's some kind of event that happens that just overwhelms us and overloads us, and our body responds with what we call as trauma. The event might be a war, like we talked about, or a fire, or an accident, or an assault, or a diagnosis. It can be discrete. It can be chronic. And, the specifics of the event matter a little bit less than the way that we respond to what happens inside of us. And, sometimes we talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response. And a long time ago, it was just fight or flight, but then we added freeze. And then we added fawn because we wanted to include me and people like me who fawn. But now the list is like really long. There's like 500 Fs. And we probably will keep adding to it, and that's lovely. But essentially it kind of goes to this idea that we experience this thing, and our somatic nervous system gets activated, and we're ready to do our thing and to take care of it and to do whatever. And sometimes it can get overloaded. And ideally, usually what happens is we experience this event, we get all activated, and then over time, we kind of come back down into baseline. We sort of, process what happened. We talk about integrating it, whatever. But here's the thing. We're all individuals, right? We all have different genetics. We all have different family backgrounds. We all have different coping skills. We all have different abilities and disabilities. We have personalities, and we have epigenetics, and we're infinitely variable. And so we don't all handle the same events in the same way. And so what might be traumatizing for someone, what might really, set them onto this, fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn response, might not affect another person the same way, which is sometimes maybe part of why it can be hard to talk about trauma or identify what is traumatizing, because it's very, very individual. Now, in a religious setting, trauma can look like lots of different things, right? The events that might lead a person to feel overwhelmed or confused or in agony or trapped. It can be all kinds of stuff that can go on, right? It can be just all sorts of things. Like we could go on and on and on, right? There could be the threat of shunning, the threat of isolation. There can be economic control and manipulation and threats of hell. And it can be, leaders up front excusing bad behavior and having different standards. It can be othering. It can be misogyny and patriarchy. Like it can go on and on and on, the ways that we can feel overwhelmed by religious contexts. And, sometimes when we talk about high control religion, which is often where folks get traumatized, is in high control religion. Sometimes we observe similarities between those contexts and contexts of like domestic abuse. So one of the people that you can't read this or see this, but you have to look, if you want to look it up, the one on the left is called the religious power and control wheel, and the one on the right is called the power and control wheel. And this was originally developed, this one over here, to describe some of the ways that folks who are in situations of domestic violence can feel trapped in those situations, and how it can become a cycle, right? And it's this dynamic of power and control. And what we've observed is that sometimes high control religion can have very, very similar patterns, and it can feel like abuse, which is really troubling and disturbing. And for queer people, for LGBTQ people, I think religious trauma can be particularly painful and damaging because frequently it has to do with core aspects of who we are. We just heard Sammy speak a moment ago about this part of him that he knew when he was little, and many of us do. And yet it's that piece that becomes the subject of the trauma, right? So we truly, truly feel trapped when the trauma has to do with who we are or who we love or how we express ourselves or who we want to marry or who we're inexplicably attracted to. We just exist, and the trauma happens. So remember that idea we talked about just a minute ago of we experience a thing, our bodies get activated, and then we come down. Sometimes we don't come down. Or sometimes we only come down a little bit, right? Sometimes that level of activation kind of stays high and it remains some kind of sensitivity like we were talking about at the very, very beginning. And like I said, this is highly variable. It's dependent on who we are and what our backgrounds are or whatever. But sometimes people really struggle to experience coming back down to kind of a baseline. And they can be really, really sensitive to events in the future. Like you can smell something, hear something. I was driving by the headquarters of my previous denomination like a month ago with my son, and I explicitly was just bawling, just crying, and I couldn't help it, and I couldn't stop it, and my son was like, "Mappa, are you okay? Like, what's going on?" And so, we had to pull over, and I explained to him what was going on. But, sometimes that activation level stays high, and we can be really, really sensitive, and, we could see a thing or have a conversation with a person or hear a certain word or hear a song, and all of a sudden we're right back into the experience like it was. And so when trauma leaves a wound like this, sometimes we describe it as that PTSD, and it can make us be avoidant, where we avoid the spaces or the people or the context where we experience the injury in the first place. It can make us have intrusive thoughts or dreams or nightmares about the thing where we're thinking about it all the time even though we don't want to. We might be reactive to it, like my friend on Facebook when she saw my post and how she reacted to seeing that thing happen, or we can be really sensitive to it. We can be hypervigilant to trying to protect ourselves from happening again. There's all sorts of ways that it can stick with us. And gosh, if you've experienced that kind of long-term activation, you know how exhausting it can be. It's hard to give yourself heart and soul into, other stuff in your life when you're constantly worried about being harmed again. That might be one of the reasons why amongst the LGBTQ community there's higher rates of suicide and higher rates of substance use and higher rates of incarceration. We suffer in unique ways often. So that's the first shade of trauma. We're going to go to the second shade of trauma for queer people in the green one. I remember years, a long time ago, my friend Caleb's here, I keep looking over him, a long time ago, because he remembers this, I worked in Yakima. He actually worked there too after me. But I remember a sermon that I preached in one of my first churches. This was like almost 20 years ago. It was a long time ago, and I was pastoring there, And I preached a sermon about the ways that we can hear God's voice, right? And so in the sermon, I talked about all the different ways that I believe that we can hear God's voice. And I talked about the scriptures, and I talked about the community of faith, and I talked about art and nature and film, and through poetry and writers, and through our bodies, and the way that we can hear God's voice, like, through our minds, and all these different ways. And it was funny, I don't think I totally realized it at the time, but I was very much like in the process of deconstructing. I don't think I, was totally aware of it at that moment, but that's what I was doing. And I remember getting a lot of feedback from people at the church about this sermon, about the ways that we hear God's voice. And I remember, folks, coming up to me and sending me emails and reminding me that there's a hierarchy to this. Like, yeah, sure, you can hear God's voice in all these ways, as long as it agrees with what we teach, as long as it agrees with our, structured doctrine and our interpretation of the Bible. Like, you can hear God's voice, but it has to agree with this in order for it to be God's voice. Like, our interpretation of the book is the most important way, and therefore, de facto, the only other way that you might hear it is if it's in full agreement. And in a way, it ends up being, the guy on the top, or the 4 white guys in the committee that decide, right? That's how you can hear God's voice. And if you think you're hearing God's voice some other way, you're going straight to hell. And for many of us who grew up in high control religious environments, whether we're queer or we're straight, this wasn't just, kind of like an implicit teaching. A lot of us were taught very explicitly, you cannot trust yourself. Right? I remember being at this men's retreat years ago. I went and attended it with my dad. It was like this for this, as a part of the denomination. And, it was during a time when I was still like trying to be a man. It didn't take, by the way. But I was really trying to like get there. I was really, I was trying to be like content and whatever. So we were at this men's retreat, and I remember this like religious, like counselor guy, sort of a psychological, emotional health guru, was speaking. And I remember he taught that he was saying this very thing: you cannot trust yourself. You cannot trust your emotions. You cannot trust anything that's coming inside you. And I remember he taught the group this song, this little sing-songy thing about like, I can't trust my emotions. I can only trust the truth. And I remember my dad, I don't remember that wasn't the jingle. I think it was probably a little more catchy, but those were pretty much the words. And I remember my dad, it was probably like so inappropriate. We were sitting in the back just cackling. It was just so ridiculous to hear this guy say, you can't trust yourself. And I think that was the first time I really heard it out loud, you can't trust yourself. But we hear it in all sorts of ways, and queer people, we definitely have heard it. Your heart is deceitfully wicked. Your compass is broken. You cannot trust yourself. You are utterly evil to your very core. And deep inside of your core, something evil and disgusting is lurking, and it's going to destroy your life, and God hates you for it. You cannot trust yourself. A lot of us that are queer, we grew up being taught this and believing this and learning that we can't trust our own bodies, we can't trust our own attractions, we can't trust what we want because they're wrong. And in fact, even beyond that, if you feel at peace about the person that you're attracted to, if you feel at peace about dressing a certain way or using a certain name or using a certain pronouns or having a family that looks like that, if you feel peace, that's just a sign that the devil has completely deceived you and you're gone. But you can trust us. You can trust us to tell you what God says. You can't trust yourself, but you can trust us. I don't know if you've ever thought of it in that way, but to me this feels real stark, real heavy. And I spent a lot of years trying to convince myself that what I was feeling wasn't what I was feeling. And a lot of queer people have that experience. Now, in a system like that, right? In a system like that where we're told that we can't trust ourselves, and we're told that we can't lean on our own understanding, and we're told that if we do, we're going to go to hell, there's all kinds of bad things that can happen, right? Yeah. Now, I was trying to have this be a joke, but it didn't work. But right, of course bad things are going to happen. So here's another joke, okay? So get ready. One of the ways is the way that guilt and shame get collapsed on top of each other. Now, you might be thinking, Esther, that's a really deep cut. That's not really what I was expecting. That's pretty, heavy observation. That was a joke again. What? I'm messing up word a lot. Oh, okay. So, when you can't trust yourself, guilt and shame get collapsed on top of one another, okay? This is how that works, okay? So guilt is the feeling that comes when I violate my own values, right? I did something bad. Shame is the feeling that comes when I violate a social norm or what's expected of me. And that feeling is the one that kind of feels corrosive and toxic, like I'm a bad person, I don't belong, right? Well, if your source of truth, if your source of identity and your source of morality is all built upon a single reference point that the white guys at the top told you about, then guilt and shame become exactly the same thing. They're one and the same. And in time, the only thing that remains is fidelity to the group, and you don't even know the difference. This is heavy, heavy stuff. This can lead to all kinds of things. I mean, for example, it can lead us to feel pressured to do things by that culture that we're in that are really against our own values. Sometimes soldiers that go to war will come back and talk about doing things that they didn't want to do or that they regret doing or that really were against their values. We call that moral injury. And it happens when guilt and shame get collapsed on top of each other. We're not able to trust our own values or to act on our own values, and we end up doing stuff that's in violation with our heart. And so for some of us queer people, and maybe some of you who are cisgender or straight feel the same thing, but for some of us who are queer, we look back on some of the things that we might have done when we were real religious, and we might feel this weight of regret. Some of us have memories of times where we could have spoke up for other queer siblings, and we didn't do it. Some of us have memories of proselytizing people into that context that ended up causing so much harm. Some of us have memories of teaching dogma that was abusive. The result is moral injury that we carry around, and that's part of the legacy of religious trauma for many of us. If we had more time, which we don't, I'd love to spend another half an hour talking about the Apostle Peter, because I love how some of this plays out in his life. I love how, especially in Acts chapter 10, you can go and read the story yourself. I love how we see in him this pressure to exclude people who are non-Jewish from the Christian community. And then he has this really unsettling experience where he has a dream and is like, no, I can trust myself. I can trust God. I know what I'm hearing. And is like, no, those people are welcome. Goodness me. What a dodge of that moral injury by way of trusting himself, trusting what he experienced, of trusting the way that God spoke to him. A third shade of the way that religious trauma affects us, a third and final shade this morning, has to do, of course, with shame, as I've already mentioned. And I think it might be the most lasting way that religious trauma sticks with, especially for queer people, is a legacy of shame. To grow up queer in America is to grow up othered. And to grow, I see someone laugh. There's a couple people laughing. There was a little bit of an Easter egg in there. I thought it was funny. But to grow up queer in America is to grow up being othered. And to grow up queer and Christian is to grow up being condemned. And to grow up and to exist as a queer person in 2024 America is to live with this constant and insisting shouting of shame. You're not real, you're not valid, you're sick, you're broken, you're disgusting, you're a threat, we're scared of you. In fact, we're going to create 600 laws to try to harm you and make you disappear. We live as queer people in shame because of church. And shame, like we said, happens when we violate social norms. And if we live in a context of heteronormativity, we live in a context of cis-sexism, we live in a context of misogyny, we end up feeling like we don't belong. And the voice of shame sounds like that. I don't belong. I'm not good enough. I don't fit in. I'm not lovable. I'm unworthy. I don't have a place here. And one of the most common things that happens when we have shame in our lives is that we hide it, right? It's really, really traumatizing. You know, we don't want to have that be exposed, right? We don't want these thoughts to be verified. And you know, gosh, like I can't imagine why I wrote like a whole book about keeping secrets. But of course, as a queer person, I knew exactly how corrosive shame could be because of the way that it leads us to keep secrets. And at least for me, keeping secrets as a way to cope with the heaviness of shame, it makes sense. But it also compounds the impact of it, right? And it creates what I've discovered is a new trauma, and that new trauma is what's called erasure. And I wasn't really able to identify that until, kind of recently. Gosh, it was, thanks to my little religious trauma group, actually. But saying hello to it. Because if I feel deeply, deeply ashamed of myself and my impulse is to hide that thing that I'm ashamed of, I can do that. Right? I can do that. If I hide in order to survive, and I conform in order to belong, right? We can survive. And I could survive for a really, really long time by being cisgender passing, or by some of you, by being straight or cisgender passing. We can do that. We can keep secrets, we can hide it, and we can survive in those contexts. And that does bring us some safety, but the cost is our own identity. The cost is erasure. And that's a really, really painful injury. Recently in Redlands, a person who was running for local office here in our city spoke up at a public school board meeting and demanded why we don't celebrate Straight Pride Month. Which led a lot of us to take a deep breath. He wanted to know, why we don't have special days celebrating rich white men. And of course, to those of us who are queer, that question is completely ridiculous, and it's obvious. We have Pride Month because queer people have been uniquely hurt by a context that shames us and wants us to disappear. We've been uniquely injured and condemned and othered and feared. And because we've gone through the trauma of hiding and the trauma of erasure, we need pride. In fact, pride is an adaptive response to shame. We celebrate pride as a way of pushing back on this narrative that we don't have a place, that we're not good enough, that God doesn't love us, that we're a threat, and on and on and on. Pride is an adaptive response to shame. And I love that we're celebrating it here as a church, and I love that we're celebrating it widely across our communities. So, we're at the end, and the sermon's been kind of a downer. I mean, I tried to crack some jokes. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but it's been kind of a downer. And religious trauma is a downer. It's heavy, it's awful. There isn't any super easy or quick solutions, I mean, my hope is that by talking about some of these things, by just sort of scratching the surface on what it might look like for some of us, my hope is that for some of us who've had those experiences, we might be able to say hello to them in our own lives a little bit, maybe in ways that we haven't yet. Maybe we'll feel a little bit validated where we have felt gaslighted in the past, right? Because I think that awareness is the first step. So maybe you come and join my little group, or maybe you find a therapist, or maybe you talk about it with a friend, or maybe you come out of the closet, or I don't know what it is, but my hope is that for some of us here who've been traumatized, that maybe this conversation this morning sparks a little bit more awareness for ways in which you might be able to heal. And then I think for the congregation at large, and for those of us who are allies or who are cisgender and who are heterosexual, I think, like I said at the beginning, I hope that it's an opportunity for us to continue to look for ways for where we might run interference, or where we might stop the harm in its tracks, right? You maybe have heard that phrase, hurt people, and it's sort of a way of individualizing a problem. But I think when it comes to, especially to religious trauma for queer people, it's a very systemic problem. And just saying that hurt people, and somebody said something mean, and that was all that constitutes religious trauma for queer people, is just to completely misunderstand what the experience is. And then we come to our thesis then for this sermon, which is at the very end, which I think that congregations can affect systemically trauma against LGBTQ people. I think we can do it, and I think we can do it in a really simple way. I mean, this isn't the only way, but I think that affirming theology is harm reduction. In just a moment, the elders of Paradox are going to read a statement of this church's policy around queer people, and explicit policies like that keep queer people on the planet. And it mitigates the trauma that can be caused by religion. And maybe it doesn't solve all of it. I kind of doubt that it does. But it's a systemic way of making change. It's a way of pushing back on that assumption that, we'll just hurt people. No. Change the policy. And if you're watching online, or you're here from a church that is not affirming, put your non-affirming policy on the website explicitly. This is what queer people can expect if you come here, so they don't come and waste years of their lives only to be rejected by you. When they're expecting, when your sign says all are welcome, it means all are welcome. Say what you actually believe. Put your policy out there. It's also harm reduction. Affirming theology is harm reduction. And obviously there's lots of stuff that we can do and go way beyond that. And I love the policy actually of Paradox Church, how that statement is reviewed each year and updated. And I know this year's statement, which we're going to read in just a moment, focuses on some real tangible actions, and I love that. It's really, really important and beautiful. So I'm going to close today like I normally do with a poem. And if you're anything like me, all of this stuff might feel a little bit overwhelming. It might feel like a lot. And it might be activating. You might have to go, like, get a massage or sit in the bath or, like, go be alone. Like, really, you might need to go take care of yourself because it's a lot. And some of you might be thinking, like, how do I recognize and heal my own trauma, let alone, affect an entire system that's causing harm? Like, it's a lot. And so I want to end with a little bit of a poem that kind of offers a word of hope, especially for those of us who might feel overwhelmed. I'm going to destroy this thing by stepping on it. I want to end with this poem that I think offers a little bit of a word of hope and encouragement for us to keep going, to keep trying, to keep pushing, to keep loving, and keep lighting the way that we might see Jesus Christ in all. And this is a poem to fulfill my promise from the very beginning. This is a poem that I heard at that conference that I spoke at, actually, and it really, really touched my heart. It's a poem called Stubborn Ounces. You say the little efforts that I make will do no good. They never prevail to tip the hovering scale where justice hangs in the balance. I don't think I ever thought they would. But I'm prejudiced beyond debate in favor of my right to choose which side shall feel the stubborn ounces of my weight. May you bless the world with your stubborn ounces.